Welcome to the Versus History Podcast with your hosts, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, Connell Smith, and Elliot Watson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Versus History Podcast. It's me, your host, Patrick at History Chappy today. Absolutely delighted to be joined by a guest all the way from Brooklyn in New York. His name is David Goren. Now, David, I approached via my Bandcamp, actually. I download a fair bit of music and I've been purchasing some of the music via a label called Death Is Not the End, and it's London pirate radio recordings, and something flashed up New York, or to be more specific still, Brooklyn pirate radio recordings, compiled or curated by a gentleman called David Goren, who we have with us now, and he's created programming for the BBC, Studio 360, NPR's Lost and Found series, Jazz at the Lincoln Center. The list goes on and on and on. David's a Brooklyn-based writer, post-production mixer, and field recordist, and he's been doing that for over 30 years. Now, I don't want to go too much into what David's done because the list is endless. I will let you do that yourself, David. But can I just say, welcome to Versus History. I'm actually delighted to have you with us. Thank you so much for giving up your time to come and talk to us and the Versus History universe. We're so grateful.
Oh, it's great to be on the program, and greetings to all the listeners. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we are absolutely delighted. For anyone that's listened to some of the back episodes of Versus History, you'll know that I'm very much into pirate radio, or at least I was in my youth. I'm from somewhere in Southeast London called Crystal Palace, which is very high elevation. And one of the things we could get for free in Crystal Palace was a lot of pirate radio across London and surrounding counties. And David, when I came across your recordings, it just brought back so many memories. So could you tell us a little bit about you, your background, and how you came to love radio in general and pirate radio in particular?
Okay, well, it's a long journey, a long story, but mainly as a kid growing up in the 60s in the United States, there were not that many sources of media at that time, sort of an era of media scarcity. On television, there were 3 main channels and a handful of UHF channels. So early on, we focused on radio as sounds that would sort of buoy our imaginations. I remember actually as a 3-year-old with my mom hearing an opera singer on the radio, and I could see the whole thing. I could see like a red velvet couch and in front of a microphone with a long gown. And so I think, getting visuals from audio over radio hit me at an early age. I remember my sister and I on a Friday night, maybe when we were 9, 10, 11 years old, would listen to faraway AM or medium wave stations, which in the United States were plentiful. There were, thousands of, and are still thousands of AM radio stations. So we would hear them, and we would make up stories sort of based on what we were hearing, some of the audio coming through. So that's pre-age 13, and then I got a shortwave radio sort of by accident from my cranky Uncle Lou. I was visiting one day. He was always railing about my long hair and rock and roll, but for some reason he gave me AM/FM radio with something I never heard before, or knew about. That's an SW, shortwave. And I asked my father on the ride home, I'm like, so what is that? He's like, you won't hear anything on that, which was fairly typical of his encouragement in those days. And when I got home, I turned it on, and it's like Radio Moscow sort of leaped out. It's almost like the radio leaped out of my hands with this very strong signal of propaganda from Radio Moscow. That was in the early 70s, and I became enamored of listening as much as I could, keeping a list of stations. I never sort of went into the full-blown anorak hobby nerd side of shortwave at that time, but a decade later, I had a rebirth where I rediscovered shortwave radio working in a secondhand bookstore, and the World Radio TV Handbook came across the counter. You may know that it was sort of, at the time, a worldwide guide to international broadcasting. And actually, they're just publishing their last print issue ever.
Wow, seminal.
Yeah. And I was able to get a shortwave radio with a digital display, and began which made it easier to know who you were listening to, and there were guides where you could look up frequencies. So in the 80s, I really dove into discovering shortwave, and that's where I first or almost first started encountering pirate shortwave broadcasts. I had read about them. They weren't that frequent. You kind of had to skulk around and try to find them. When I heard them, some of them were better than others. But I always was interested in the concept of pirate radio, which is basically unregulated, unlicensed radio outside of the government system. In the US, the public they're the owners of the airwaves, but it's regulated by the government. And so regulations often close a lot of people out. So not to give you too much of a chronology, but I started seeing someone in New York City where I was living in Washington and coming up to like every week. And I discovered that New York City had an active FM pirate radio scene and also some on AM. The New York Times articles in 1982 says there were about 12 regular stations on. And I had not really encountered it outside of a few stray stations. So it was really fascinating to tap into this subculture. The format at the time was different than it is today. It was what some people term kids playing radio, sort of, hacker, prankster, hippie underground types who would dare to come on the air, usually late at night, after midnight, often on a weekend, and broadcast for a couple hours. There are stations like WHOT, WFUN, WSCX, you get the idea. And transgressive, these people were it was at the time, it was a big taboo. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission that oversees and regulates the use of the airwaves in the United States, they were very active, and they would play sort of cat and mouse games with the pirates by tracking them, triangulating their signal, trying to track them down, and the pirates would move, or the pirates would monitor the VHF safety channels where government agencies would communicate. So they would hear the FCC guy in his car talking to home base, and when he got near the pirate studios or transmitters, the pirates would shut down, and then hear him, bewildered, like what happened to that signal. So that was my first big encounter with listening to pirate radio. Over the course of the next decade, things started to change. There is a whole history I could go into. These prankster pirates, kids playing radio pirates, and occasionally there would be like strange, political and religious point of view stations. One was called Voice of Tomorrow, which was a right-wing, like white supremacist station, and a lot of the pirates had more conventional left-wing, hippie underground type views. They date back to about 1969. There's always been pirate radio in the United States since 1934, when there was a Telecommunications Act passed, because prior to that, in the 20s, there was like a broadcasting free-for-all. And so the Telecommunications Act of 1934 put this licensing structure in place. And so if you didn't have a license, you were a pirate, and the government would try to keep you off the air. So, as I said earlier, often the FCC would come, they'd shut the stations down, they would confiscate the equipment, they would fine the broadcasters.
In terms of what you talked about, in terms of pirate radio, I mean, it was almost a carbon copy, identical picture in the United Kingdom for our listeners there. It was the Department of Trade and Industry that used to go around shutting down pirates on the FM dial. I remember so clearly and crisply. It was Rinse FM 91.8 I used to listen to, Cool FM 94.5, Upfront FM 99.3, and Delight FM 103.0. I remember it like it was yesterday. So much symmetry with Britain's capital. So look, please set the scene for us. Let's talk about pirate radio in New York City in particular. What do you consider to be its sort of early origins or genesis, David?
One of the early stations of what I call the modern era was founded by this gentleman, Alan Weiner, a high school student living in Yonkers, New York. And he started WKOV and WSCX among others. And he and a friend of his sort of had a network, and they were broadcasting 24 hours a day for a bit until they had a very rude awakening at 5 a.m. Alan basically his room was invaded by FCC agents who said, "Alan Weiner, wake up, you're under arrest." And while they were arresting him, like a dozen people were hauling all this equipment out of his basement. At the time, there was something called Radio Row near the World Trade Center in Manhattan, which was where all the radio dealers were, like historically, like from the 30s up until probably the early 70s. And so he would buy all this surplus equipment, military equipment, transmitters, and he would give it out. He was sort of like a Johnny Appleseed character. He would give these out to others. After he was busted by the FCC, they let him off, sort of with a warning. And for a while, he moved away and actually started some legal stations in Spain. But he came back to the New York area in the mid 80s and sort of got all of the people who started stations because of him, or people who were, their friends and rivals all at the same time. He got them to join in a venture that echoed sort of what happened in the UK in the 1960s. Alan, who is a broadcast engineer, was doing some work for Radio North Sea International, which was an 80s pirate station off the coast of England. He came back and decided to buy a ship, which he dubbed the Sarah after his girlfriend, and got all the other pirates, or most of them in the area, involved. They broadcast from international waters off of Long Beach, Long Island, to the New York area, mostly rock and roll. I think the intent was to be a sort of a free speech radio station, but to the press, they kind of passed it off as like, rock music is dead on Radio New York, and we're the alternative. As I said, they lasted just a couple of days. They were shut down, boarded by the Coast Guard. And again, he sort of escaped big penalties, but that was one of his last big ventures in pirate radio. Now he's actually a legal shortwave radio broadcaster with a station called WBCQ, where he broadcasts the most sort of virulent right-wing material under the ethos of free speech. So what happened after Radio New York International was shut down? The other pirates in the area, people who ran stations like WHOT and Stereo 9 FM, they started sort of to fight with each other and steal each other's equipment and try to rat each other out. And that activity started to devolve. And in my research, it seemed to create an opening in the late 80s, early 90s for a different kind of pirate radio broadcaster. There started to be stations that were serving the immigrant communities of New York City rather than sort of just the audio pranksters. And this was because the media landscape in New York was changing. Airtime was becoming very expensive. If you're not politically or economically connected, and you want to have a radio station, it's very, very difficult. It's a very difficult process to go through. So there started to be stations in the West Indian community, the Haitian community, and in the African American community. There were hip hop pirate radio stations. I did one of the first bits of my research bearing fruit was a documentary I did called Outlaws of the Airwaves: The Rise of Radio Station WBAD for KCRW's Lost Notes podcast. And that chronicled a hip hop station that was on for about 3 years from 1995 to 1998. And with impunity, they did not have too much hassle staying on the air during that time. Their modus operandi was to come on Sunday nights when the commercial hip hop station, Hot 97, would change the programming to like a talk format and a love advice show. And I think they also did have a West Indian music show during that time. So there was this hip hop thirsty audience that had nothing to listen to on Sunday nights. So they started tuning in WBAD on 91.9, which was started by this genius, seat of his pants entrepreneur, DJ Syntronics, who was a club DJ at the time. His initial impetus to be on the radio is that being a club DJ, he went to visit a friend, also, a club music, dance music DJ, went to his apartment, saw his friend had some turntables, and he could hear him on the radio in the room. And he was like, what's going on? And the wire from this gentleman's studio or apartment went down a dumbwaiter shaft and into another apartment in the building where this guy named Dr. X, who was running a station called WJQR Nasty Radio. And so Dr. X pioneered selling airtime to DJs, often in dance music and hip hop music. And DJ Centronics became Dr. X's protege, and Dr. X sold DJ Centronics a transmitter, and Centronics put his own station on the air here in Brooklyn. As I say in the documentary, or as he says, he called up his friends and said, turn on 91.9. And they're like, what the hell are you doing on the radio? And it became very, very popular because in part, and this is probably more analogous to the kind of broadcasting that you were growing up with in London than sort of the earlier era, he became very savvy that there was a need to be met with his station. And he recruited some DJs. He had like a whole crew during the week. It was mostly a weekly show on Sundays for about 8 or 9 hours. And during the week, they would go to recording studios where sort of they would surreptitiously be handed cassette or a DAT tape of demos and things that had not been released. And also the legal station, Hot 97, could not play the naughty words. And so, but an unlicensed pirate station could. So they were renowned for not having to bleep out all the profanity in hip hop. And so they lasted until about 1998 when they were. There was sort of a dispute within the station. DJ Centronics was sort of very cagey and protective of his station, but one of his DJs, a very ambitious 19-year-old Dren Starr, was contacted by a news reporter who'd been doing a story on payola in the hip hop community. Payola is where record label will pay for airplay, and it's illegal, actually. So this reporter contacted Dren Starr, and Dren was like, yeah, I want, I'd love to tell you all about our station. And he asked DJ Centronics, and Centronics was like, no way, they're going to shut us down. We don't want to be on a TV news program. But behind his back, Dren Starr, who by that time, WBAD had become so sophisticated that they had 2 studios connected by a high quality phone line that broadcasters used called a Comrex, or the piece of equipment is called that. And so Dren was in a New York housing, New York public housing on the Lower East Side, and DJ Centronics was in Brooklyn. So they trade off hours, and then they would do it together. So one night, Centronics thought he had made clear that no, we're not doing this, we can't do it. But it turns out that one night, Dren invited the reporter to a broadcast from his studio, and Centronics was a bit suspicious. It was like, well, why are you having all these amazing people, like cream of the local hip hop community? So Centronics suspected something was up, and he pre-taped his hour. He would go on first and put the tape on, instructed his girlfriend to keep an eye on it, jumped in his car and drove like 20 minutes from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and showed up at Dren's studio, and they were all like shocked to see him there. And the reporters were there, Barbara Nevins-Taylor of a station called UPN 9. And he was upset. He was like, I don't want you to do this, but he couldn't really stop them. And at the last minute, they persuaded him to be in silhouette, sort of in shadow, on the news report as well. And it was broadcast about a week later. And about a week after that, they were shut down. And Centronics did not want to go back on the air after that. So that was sort of a storied era of 90s hip hop pirate radio in Brooklyn.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Okay, let's move on to the next question about Brooklyn in particular. Now, for anyone like me that's tried to walk the length of Brooklyn, from the Brooklyn Bridge to Dyker Heights to see the Christmas lights, you'll know that Brooklyn is absolutely massive geographically. So, look, it's also very diverse and it's a wonderful place. So why did pirate radio take off in Brooklyn in particular, as opposed to sort of New York City in general? And how does your pirate radio map, which you can tell us all about, offer a snapshot of that story?
Yes, well, my focus has been on Brooklyn in part because I live here, and I'm in the heart of the current day pirate radio scene. I would say in the early era, there was activity everywhere, and in fact there still is. But the current scene, Brooklyn, I would say, at the moment, just to give you a little broader picture. So in New York City, there are pirate radio hotspots everywhere. Today, they're sort of focused on diverse immigrant communities. So there's one in Brooklyn, there's one in the Bronx, there's a couple in Queens, a couple in New Jersey. That broadcast mainly to West Indian and Latino audiences. How is Brooklyn unique within all that? Well, Brooklyn has the most activity. Brooklyn has the most numbers of stations. And I think it's because of what you said, because of the sheer diversity. In the Bronx, the stations are largely Latino. In New Jersey, there's sort of a mix of Latino and West Indian. Here, there are Orthodox Jewish, Latino, actually not very much Latino, mostly West Indian, but very diverse. And I would say the other areas of New York, they have about 10 to 15 active stations. In New York, we have about 33 active stations, and that's in part because of a subset of stations for the Haitian community. I live near a very heavily populated area of Haitian immigrants, and so of the 30 stations I hear a night, about 12 of them are Haitian and broadcasting in Creole. And a lot of the activity reflects what was going on in the home country, the Haitians that sort of give the extra oomph to the Brooklyn scene, at least today. And that's in part, I interviewed someone who at the time was head of Haitian studies at the City University of New York. And, I'm like, well, why are the Haitians here going on the air? Why are they chancing, arrest, and why is it so important? Is that because during the Duvalier regime, which Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier from the late 50s into the early 90s, they basically had a lockdown on information in the country, with the exception of one station, Radio Haiti Inter, which was run by this agronomist, Jean Dominique. There's a film actually called The Agronomist. So he said, in Haiti, a peasant in the fields, rather than spend their extra money on tobacco, they would save up to buy batteries for their transistor radios. He even named the types. One was called Gem and one was called Trident, because they wanted to tune into news from off the island of Haiti, which Haiti shares with the Dominican Republic. So there was a big wave of Haitian immigration to the US starting in the 60s. And the pirate activity didn't really start until the 90s. Right away, they were finding media outlets to get their message out. And in part, Haiti is a very oral culture, and the literacy rate is somewhat low. And also these stations were broadcasting in Creole rather than French, although there is probably some French content as well. And so in the Haiti of the Duvalier regime, all the radio was in French. And so Radio Haiti Inter, they were the first to very slowly introduce Creole to reach beyond the capital, Port-au-Prince. So when people come here from Haiti, they like to set up radio stations. And, it makes them sort of a person of influence in their community. It's a way for community leaders to come together. I've spoken to some Haitian politicians, people who are in our city council members or in the New York State government. And they have gone on those stations and, to bring their campaigns to people. But now they have a list like, oh, we can't go there because that's not a legal station. But they are so seamlessly part of the fabric of the community that now most people don't think of them as anything out of the ordinary. And in this late day, I guess, except for me, not a lot of people are thinking radio is not at the top of their minds, because there are so many other sources of information.
Absolutely.
So I've spoken to, I've gone on the street in my neighborhood and do you listen to these stations? No, I only listen to YouTube. I only listen to the internet. But then I do find people who know about them as well. And clearly the stations themselves, there's lots of audience participation, be it lots of call-ins. And, and the DJs they're from the community themselves. And they advertise as well. They, small, restaurants and car services and funeral homes that would never be on commercial radio. There's just the economic model of U.S. commercial radio could never support, a roadie shop, advertising. But, maybe they pay like $20 a week and have their name mentioned on the air. So it's very much a local community thing. And a lot of people have lost consciousness of what pirate radio even is.
Thanks, David. Could you tell us about your pirate radio map? I mean, I had great fun playing with it, but there'll be people out there that have never come across it. What is it, and where can we get hold of it?
Yes, well, it's the Brooklyn Pirate Radio sound map, and it's at pirateradiomap.com. We'll bring you to a landing page, and then you have the choice. You can click on a button that says "Go to the map," which will bring you directly to the map. And you could also go there via map.pirateradiomap.com. And then there's an essay, sort of what I call a sonic essay, under the name of Tracing Neighborhoods, or Tracing Neighborhoods in the Sky. Basically, what happened was, for years, as I was sort of, slowly getting into the field of radio, being a radio producer and recording engineer, about 10, 15 years ago, I was sort of translating some of my love of shortwave into sort of some documentaries and like a personal audio blog. Podcast, I guess a podcast would be more accurate. And all along, and then I had a small child that I was very involved in his care. And, so when you have a kid, it's hard to think straight and do much extra. But for years, I was like, because starting in the 90s, where you could only hear pirates a couple of days a week, very, very late at night, it was a very stealthy maneuver. In the early 90s, they started to crash on the dial in great numbers. So what I was hearing over the past 25 years was, I kept saying to myself, I've got to do something about this. I have to catalog this, but my mind was elsewhere for a lot of the time. What happened was rates really skyrocketed in the 90s. And so people who would rent a station, programmers in these different communities, on an AM radio or a medium wave radio station for an hour on the weekends, they began to get priced out. And then there was another Telecommunications Act, not of 1934, but 1996, which allowed commercial radio station owners to buy even more stations in a market. There had been a prohibition to only owning a few, and then they could own many. And that led to a lack of diversity on the airwaves, and scarcity and lack of opportunity to get on the air. So in the 90s, when I was tuning in, I was incredulous, because I was hearing, how could this person be on the air? At 7:00 on a Wednesday, they're going to get busted. But what happened was, with the rise of the pirates, was also defunding of the Federal Communications Commission, and a lot of the rules and regulations became a paper tiger. So that's a long preamble to say that by 2014, my child was finally in high school and needed me a little less, and I had a long-term commitment, co-producing public radio program Jazz at Lincoln Center, had come to an end. And so I thought, this is the time I get to reckon with figuring out the pirates. So being in Brooklyn and being lucky to be in such a fertile area, I started to record them. I started to try, to do research and find out who they were, and sort of to map the shape of the scene. And so I had done some early I had done a couple talks about it once I had some research at a hackers conference, for instance, or shortwave radio enthusiasts conference, where a lot of pirate radio enthusiasts also would attend. And so I was starting to think, from my professional side, maybe I'll do a documentary about this. And there were actually, this was about 2014, as I said, and sound maps were becoming a new phenomenon. And which I was very interested in. So like, say, a public radio station would do a news story, and then they're on their website, they would have a map of the geographical area, and you could click on clips, say that 3 times fast, to listen to things that were associated to the story that maybe were not in, the radio story proper, but there were extras. Well, I was really intrigued by that. And so I started to think maybe I could put together a sound map based on Brooklyn Pirate Radio. So eventually I was actually able to get a small grant, which allowed me to find a JavaScript programmer who understood what I was after, because a lot of other people just kind of scratch their heads. Like, I don't know what you want to do, or that will cost you $20,000 to construct this elaborate database. But by somewhat the seat of our pants, we made the first iteration of the Brooklyn Pirate Radio sound map that came out in 2018. And I got more funding, and I enhanced it in many ways and released it, I guess, 1 year ago. And now I'm hopefully trying to get funding for another iteration. So basically, And this also, the way I structured it brings in my own love of radio, because what you see are, if you look at the map at pirateradiomap.com, you will see the Flatbush area of Brooklyn, where I live, Flatbush, East Flatbush, Midwood, a few other sections where the pirates are coming from. I don't want to, my aim is not to expose the pirates to trouble or fines or penalties. So I show where the broadcasts are aimed towards. I don't show transmitter locations. I don't know them for the most part, and I would not divulge them. I could walk down the street if you were here, and I could say, that's a pirate radio antenna, probably. And then there's a church which has a station, and they have a huge, like, Rube Goldbergian style antenna above their church. So I had been recording since 2014. So once we had the map up and running, we added the samples. And what I was getting at earlier, a little bit before, was the interface was very important to me. So you see these zones, and you can click on a zone. If you click on the zone, you will see a list of stations on the right. You can click on any of those stations and it will play a sound. The sound will play on a tuner, which is in the upper left of the screen. And basically it has buttons you can click on. You can go back and forth, up and down the dial. These are not live from the stations. It's basically a curated archive. So I took the hours of broadcasts I have and I chop them up into bits. So the top level has a lot of station IDs, like short 1-2 minute jingles and greetings from DJs. But there's a capacity to have as much as 10 sounds per station. There's a button on the bottom of the tuner that says archive, and you can click on that and you can actually leave it open as you tune up and down the dial, and you can see what samples are available for you to listen to. There is a scrub bar where you can move back and forth in the recording. And I don't know if people are using this feature, but on the last grant round, I added an auto playback where you could have sort of the ultimate pirate radio jukebox. You can listen to the stations in order from left and right. You can hear them randomly. So that's sort of just a bit of extra fun I added to the tuner. There's probably about 300 sounds on the map at the moment. And I would say at least 150 hours of sound that you could explore. I do update it from time to time. I'm waiting for another update. If I'm in a grant round now where if I get the funds, I'm going to add 2 historic layers to the map to reflect the earlier eras that I was telling you about, sort of the 70s to the 80s, the kids playing radio pranksters, hippies, the 90s, which was becoming a sort of a more ethnically diverse scene. But there was also a progressive element, like people in the hipster neighborhoods in Williamsburg, they had stations as well. And most of the earlier era stations, they're all off the air. It's very much sort of a grassroots community radio scene for the West Indian, Latino, and in a few cases, the Orthodox Jewish community.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I think that allows us to segue nicely into the next point, which is your newest release on Bandcamp, which for those that don't know, it's a music platform. It's via the label Death Is Not the End, somewhat morbidly titled, but lots of very lively content. It really does capture a flavour of pirate radio in Brooklyn. There's lots of symmetry to the pirates I used to listen to in London, with like pitched up records mixed into each other, lots of chopping and scratching, MCs calling for rewinds, etc. So it's really, really energetic and captivating. Could you tell us more about that in case somebody out there wants to actually go and move beyond the pirate radio map and actually purchase a slice of this history? What's that release all about?
Well, that was a bit of fun that came about after the map was the Wire, the UK music magazine, has, I don't know if they do this annually, but they had a big feature on radio. And they wrote an article about the map. And Luke Owen, who runs Death Is Not the End, and I think the name is actually based on an old Christian hymn. And he contacted me, and it's a really, really interesting little cassette. He releases them physically on cassette and sometimes on vinyl, but you can also hear them on the Bandcamp page. So that's basically a sampler of some of my favorites. Some are from the map and some are completely new. Side A is like a general roundup of what you were saying, sort of the DJs toasting and ads and and just a real interesting mix of sounds, advertisements from psychics. And then side B features sort of an interesting turn in this current pirate radio scene during COVID. When COVID hit, knocked out a lot of my remote field recording work, and I was home a lot, and I started listening even more, which seems hard to believe, but I started listening and recording almost all the time, like recording 15 to 24 hours a day, these stations. And when I started to hear previously, the content was largely musical, but I did not hear a lot about current events, things happening now, maybe outside of the Haitian stations. Also, the stations also function like as a feed of signals from home, which ironically they get off the internet. So often the stations will sign on in the early evening with news from like a newscast from Jamaica or Trinidad, or places from home. COVID changed how these stations operated, the coronavirus, COVID-19. So what I started to notice in March 2020 were stations that were not on during the day. Most of them come on in the evening or are on all weekends. Many started coming on during the day, and they started having content that was all about COVID. And the audiences that they broadcast to, particularly here in Brooklyn, were among the hardest hit in the early waves. So there would be shout outs to people in the hospital, or be reminiscences of people who passed on, calls for safety for essential workers. They would put local politicians on the air who maybe knew or didn't know, as I said earlier, whether they were on a pirate radio station. So side B of the tape has a lot of the COVID-related material.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Okay, I think this next, pretty much final question gets to the heart of the cultural tapestry that is pirate radio. Could you tell us why and how pirate radio stations are such an intrinsically important part of the cultural tapestry of the big city, be it New York, London, Birmingham, Berlin, Paris, or wherever?
Well, I think with what's happening in a lot of big cities, and particularly New York, is there's a lot of gentrification. There's a lot of people being pushed out or pushed deeper.
Certainly a lot of that in Brooklyn and Williamsburg. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very, very much so. And here, where we're fairly far out in Brooklyn and have been living here for a long time, and my wife and I have joked that people would need a visa to come visit us. Like someone who lived in Manhattan would like look down at their nose, or like, why do you live in Brooklyn? Why do you live an hour away? Of course, now the world has come to Brooklyn, but the stations themselves are hanging fast. And so how I relate to the gentrification is this is still very strong evidence that these stations and these cultures, in their physical reality, are a very important part of New York, and they deserve to have a voice. And they feel closed out of regular avenues to being on the air. They are on the internet in large part, but as I alluded to earlier, their audiences are very used to radio, and radio is very significant. Now, who's listening? How many people are listening? If I went out now and talked to 10 people, maybe 3, 4, or 5 people would know what I'm talking about. The others would say, I don't listen to the radio anymore. So it's radio like going back to its roots, to its original use, where it's just this voice that embodies community. Or it's these invisible signals that cluster over neighborhoods, and they are an invisible analog in the sky to what's happening in the neighborhoods below. And so now, and of course, as I get older, and when you live in a place for a while, you take a lot of things for granted. And now I'm like, wow, these things, they seem so present and they seem so rich and lively, but there might be a time when these are not around anymore, or when these are, even now in parts of the Caribbean community where the coffee shops and hipsters have moved in, old practices like steel bands practicing in an empty lot, well, they can't do that anymore because the empty lot is gone with the new apartment building, or the fancy new building next to it complains, like, why are you're making too much noise. So pirate radio sort of as a way to still sustain these old structures of culture. What I also wanted to say was, doesn't matter how many people are listening, I don't know. There's an early broadcaster, DJ D-Life, who's in my BBC documentary, who was in the 90 waves of high activity. And he's like, oh, now, it's just friends and family. It's just, and it does sound like that in some cases. It's the DJ will say he's talking to people over the radio that seem mostly to be his friends, or like, he's referring to his Instagram page. In other cases, it seems like the audience is broader. But I think what is important, and there was this, I learned this lesson from a station in Washington, D.C., which was sort of part of the progressive pirate radio wave in the 90s. They said, we had our antenna in the attic, and so we didn't get out that far, and which is maybe why they never got busted. But they said, it didn't matter necessarily who was listening, because we created a hub for the community. Kids from high school will come in after school and learn to make programs. And I think that's what's happening here in Brooklyn too. They are the basis for a lot of creative work in the communities now. DJs will come on and announce their shows in the clubs. So it's just a really interesting way to keep track of the life in the community.
Absolutely, David. And the things you've just spoken about take me to my own teaching with my own students when I'm teaching about colonial America. One of the typical questions is, okay, so King George III did this, George Washington that, Alexander Hamilton the other, but what did the average colonist do? And I will say, no, it's quite difficult, because they only punctuate public life when they punctuate public life, either with a baptism, a marriage, a death, or maybe being called to court for some other reason or the other. But apart from that, it's very difficult to get a handle on what was life like for the average colonist, or alternatively, what was life like for the average person in Tudor England under Henry VIII. But what you're doing is really capturing the other side, right? And that's so valuable, because if you didn't do it, then it wouldn't be done. And someone 3,000 miles across the Atlantic wouldn't ever have heard of Brooklyn Pirate Radio. But the fact you've done it and put it out there means that it's a cultural tapestry available for all to take part in. And thank you so much, David, on behalf of everyone, for compiling this, curating this, and putting this on the internet, because essentially it allows it to live. It sounds somewhat melodramatic, but it allows it to live forever in some sort of sense. So thank you for that. Look, David, is there anything that my limited, short-sighted, parochial questions haven't allowed you to talk about in terms of pirate radio in Brooklyn that you would otherwise have wanted to address?
No, I think you covered it very well. I'll just add to your last point that it really is a window into a community, to the very intimate life in the community. You will hear hours of a live prayer service in Haitian Creole, impassioned preaching. There are a couple of churches that have their own stations. And a lot of the other stations invite preachers on the air. So you hear a lot of very local, very heartfelt content that you would not, as an outsider to the neighborhoods, as easily encounter.
Just for the other side, in London, lots of the pirate radio stations I mentioned have now become either legal pirate stations, well, not pirate anymore, just genuine, straight up legal stations, or they're now on the internet. Cool FM 94.5 has become Cool London, which streams all day, every day, I think. And Rinse FM, it used to be 91.8, is now 106.8 to London, but more importantly, broadcasts as Rinse on the internet 24 hours a day, and I think as a Paris arm as well. So this stuff really has legs, it really has gravitas. And thank you so much from myself and everyone else for putting it all together and for coming to speak to us today. Look, guys, what we'd like to do is I'd like to purchase a copy of David's most recent release via Death Is Not the End on Bandcamp. So basically this insight, this window, this segue into pirate radio in Brooklyn for, just say, 2 lucky listeners out there. So I'll put my hand in my pocket. I think it's a fantastic initiative and want to support it. So David, you need to help me out here. We'll do it via a question basis. Could you ask a question? I'm putting you really on the spot here, so I do apologize, but it's for a good cause. Could you ask a question about something perhaps you've talked about in the podcast with a single factual answer, hopefully pertaining to pirate radio? So I'll give you all of 5 seconds to think of a question with a single factual answer. Now, listeners, if you know the answer to the question, all you need to do is go to versushistory.com and the blog there, or just via our social media handle, and it'll be a really simple answer pro forma, just bang in the answer. And what I'll do is I'll draw 2 answers out of the hat, and I'll purchase this release for you via Bandcamp and send it over to you. So David, apologies, but as you know, it's for a good cause. Could you give us a question about pirate radio in New York, Brooklyn, or worldwide? Over to you.
What is the regulatory body that enforces the law against pirate radio stations?
That's, well, in England, it used to be the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, but that's not the answer for this one. So I've hopefully helped you along the way there, folks. So if you know the answer, just head over to versushistory.com, bang in the answer, and I will draw 2 out of the hat, and I will get that release over to you gratis on behalf of myself, David, and Versus History. Look, David, thank you so much for giving up your time to come and talk about it. I'm so grateful. I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic, and please keep doing it as much as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness allows you to do so.
Oh yes, thanks so much. Well, I am diving ever more into various pirate radio projects, and you can hear about some of them or listen to some of my documentaries on the pirateradiomap.com on the About page. We'll give you links to some of my additional material. It's great to talk with you, and great to talk to your audience. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Versus History podcast. Visit us at www.versushistory.com and follow us at Versus History on Twitter and Instagram. You can download all episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or from wherever you get your podcasts.